I'm excited to share that my latest book, How to Pay Your Mortgage Off in 10 Years, was announced as a finalist in the Personal Finance and Investment category of the 2024 Australian Business Book Awards. With its non-preachy, or at least I hope it is, easy to follow advice and heaps of brand new frugal tips, this book is helping thousands of people ditch their debt and reduce their mortgage. It is available online and in all good bookstores. Humour Frugalistas, and welcome. Today I have a very special guest on this podcast, and of course all of my guests are special. If you have ever bought or sold property, and many people did during the recent boom, you have probably worked with a lawyer. So today we're going to talk about the legal aspects of buying and selling property, and we might even, just to scare you a little bit, do a deep dive into some things that could go horribly wrong, which is useful to know so that you can make sure when you next have a transaction that it goes really, really right. But first, I have a favour to ask of you. If you enjoy this podcast as much as I do and find it useful for you, please pay it forward by sharing with a friend. And even better, please follow this podcast, The Joyful Frugalista. Today's guest is Ox Rooms, which stands, I believe, for Online Exchange, co-founder Matthew Carmody. So Matthew is a former commercial and residential real estate lawyer, and he has won not once but 3 times the REA ICT, which is Real Estate Institute of ACT Awards for Excellent, as the Solicitor of the Year, which is not an easy award to obtain at all, not once but 3 times. He and his wife Em have developed Ox Rooms to bring innovation to the conveyancing process and provide greater transparency. And we'll hear a little bit more about their innovation in this podcast. So welcome, Matthew.
Thanks very much, Serena. It's a real pleasure to be here.
So thanks for joining me to talk about property, which is something, as you probably know, I really love and has certainly really kick-started my own wealth. And I must say, it's probably from being a child and when I was younger playing Monopoly. It's something that's just really stuck with me forever. Yes.
Oh, look, I think we have that in common. Em and I are both really passionate about property, personally and professionally. So it's a great topic to discuss. We really enjoy it.
Do you get competitive at Monopoly like I do?
I do, yeah. I'm not the best at it, unfortunately, but I enjoy
it. Well, it happens to the best of us, I guess. But yes, I have many family members who refuse to play with me now. But anyway, moving on. So often when people buy property, and usually their first purchase, although not always, because there is a rent invest trend, but usually when they buy property, it's for their home and it's their first home, and they might have saved a long time to do it. It's the first time they've done it. Often it's the only time they do it, or at least something they don't do very often. And in that process, they might be thinking about their finance, they might be thinking about local schools, they might be thinking about the colour scheme or the landscaping, but they probably don't think about their lawyer. Is that your experience?
Look, I think I don't think it's at the top of the list of things that most buyers, and particularly first-time buyers, will focus on. It's an important thing, but it doesn't land at the start. So when we're talking about buyers and first-time buyers in particular, I think we're probably a little bit down the order. And maybe that's okay in some circumstances.
So when someone's looking to buy or sell property and they're looking to choose a lawyer, so I guess we probably should ask how they find a lawyer, but what should be looking for when finding the best lawyer?
The thing is probably to understand your expectation, you want and what you expect. You've got a better chance of trying to work out from there who's going to be able to meet that brief. That's probably hard to do if you're on the outside, but certainly give it some thought. The next thing I would probably do if I'm in that first home buyer space, or lucky enough to not regularly engage with lawyers, you don't have a need for them all the time, is start.
Yeah, hopefully not.
Yeah, and that's pretty common, and very happy for people that don't always do it. Start with friends and family and referrals. I mean, people who have had a positive or a negative experience near you that can be a great source of sort of early intelligence. The next place I would probably go to is if you're shopping for houses, I'd be talking to the agents while I'm there about what they think. They know the area, they know who they want to work with and who they like to work with. So that's another really important intelligence gathering source.
On that, I've always wondered whether there were kickbacks with that, or is it actually, are they allowed to get kickbacks from lawyers?
That depends. It's jurisdictional. In the ACT, you're not allowed to, I don't think. It kind of depends on the jurisdiction, but if they do, they typically are required to disclose it. So I think there are circumstances where it's practical and appropriate, but it needs to be disclosed. And I know in most circumstances, it will be in the cost documentation. I would say about that, it's not necessarily taboo or wrong to go with a recommendation from a real estate agent. It might seem like they have different objectives, or they might not be on your side, but the legal team ultimately will be on your side. They have their professional obligations, and the real estate agent sort of has a view about who they like to work with. And if you think about any project, you can put a bunch of great players, a bunch of really good performers together for the first time and not get the best result. And you can compare that with a group of people that have worked together a number of times, and it's a bit smoother and it's a bit easier. And so with every property transaction, we have so many people involved in it that you probably don't consider at the outset. A team that's got a level of experience together and cohesion can be really valuable. If I go back to the question at hand, the next place I'd probably go is Google to have a look around, but I certainly wouldn't start there because AdWords and other things, kind of pollute the environment, and you've still got to do some due diligence. And then I'd probably talk to a couple. Not necessarily everyone, and not in necessarily a race about price or to sharpen up price, but to get a feel for what it is they deliver and how that aligns with what you're going to need as a home purchaser. Some people want a high level of engagement and help and advice, and other people want to be left alone nearly the whole time and be told what to do. And you don't know where you fit compared to where the lawyer fits. So I would check it out with them as part of that decision-making process.
Yeah, that makes sense, because if you buy and sell property all the time, you probably don't need to have everything explained to you all the time, although there is a legal obligation to do that. But if you haven't done it before, it's your first time, you probably want a little bit more explanation as you're going through about what certain things mean.
Yeah, and I think that's fair enough. But the professionals that are doing it as well, they might be doing hundreds of these a year, and everybody's requirement is kind of personal to them. So there is a midline that they sort of deliver to everybody, and then some people want more and some people want less. So if what you're looking for, if your priority set is a smooth experience and lots of care and attention, you can get a good gauge of whether or not you're going to get that by talking to them and by understanding. And then you can make a decision based on that. You can consider aspects like price, but I wouldn't prioritize price. I wouldn't necessarily price the same weight as I would give some of these other aspects about, your other priority set.
Makes sense. So I promised at the outset that we would talk about some war stories, some worries about bad deals. But what are some of the more common pitfalls that people you see with clients? Some fairly obvious things that could have perhaps been remedied.
If we're talking about buyers of property, I'd say the starting point is, I suppose, a mismatch of expectations that can have a real snowball effect. And what I mean by that is everybody, if you're buying, you've got your bank involved, probably an agent on the other side involved, you've got your lawyers involved, and there might be various other people around. And so if it takes a long period of time and there's a misalignment there can be the building of some frustration. The pitfalls from there start to be things like rushing or not knowing what you want to do or how you want to do it. Another really common issue that people have is, well, if we're talking about auctions or even private treaty matters, going and signing things and then going to talk to your lawyer is really quite limiting in terms of the scope of things the lawyer is going to be able to do with you. So I would recommend engaging early on that front.
And actually auctions, that's a big one, because when you bid at auction, you win at auction, then you usually have to settle. I think it's within 30 days of the ACT, is that it?
It varies. That's a contractual term, that settlement timeframe, but the standard is 30 days. But yeah, that's a really important issue with auctions. I mean, the fall of the hammer at the auction, if you're successful, is the close of negotiations, if I can put it that way. So the time to negotiate anything you might need, like a longer settlement period, or a smaller deposit, or if you want to keep the statue that's out the front, or whatever it's going to be, the time to make all those inquiries is before the auction. If you need advice on the contract, and you do need advice on the contract, the time to get that advice is also before the auction. And that's really important, because the hammer falls and you're then obliged to enter the contract. That's not negotiation time. So if you have plans for the property that are, if you have certain plans for renovations or other bits and pieces, and you don't know what rights attached to the land, you don't know what condition the property is in beyond what you can see, you're really edging towards introducing a lot more risk into the transaction than you probably anticipate when you turn up at the auction to bid.
So what happens if you turn up to the auction, you bid, you're successful, you've got your 30 days, and then you discover when you see your lawyer that there's something you had no idea about, like a major easement going through the property, so that, it might be zoned for a, main road, and in fact, things might have actually progressed with that. So, your dream of a knockdown rebuild is really going to be impacted on that.
In all probability, you're in real strife. You sign the contract on the auction day and you walk out of there, and if you're getting this advice 5 days later, you're bound to it and you have to complete the contract. So unless there's some sort of issue where things weren't properly disclosed in the contract, or there's been some other breach that you can kind of introduce, you've got real problems. So I would look at that, auction participation as a one-way door. You need to know everything you can know about your own circumstances and what you need, and the circumstances of the property, before you can make a decision about how much you want to spend and what you want to do. And if you leave one or the other of those out, you might make it, but your exposure to risk and a successful and happy transaction, change dramatically.
Yeah, it's a hard one too, and it may not even be that negative, but certainly where I live now, I don't know that it would have shown up per se, but long after I moved in, I found out from other residents that there were some significant problems with the original build. Not to the sort of, what's the Sydney one, the Opal Apartments, not to that level, able to be mostly rectified, but certainly more expensive than I had thought for the body corporate. The body corporate fees did go up. And now I don't know that reading the body corporate records would have helped, because I don't think it had been addressed by the body corporate at that point. But, to what extent do people need to be aware of those sorts of things and be proactive?
I mean, you're trying to make a decision. I suppose you're trying to make the best decision you can based on the information that's available to you. And so there are some real limitations around that. You can't see the future. There are obviously things like latent defects that cannot be observed. But you do yourself a real service by making sure that you read that material. So for the sale of a unit or the purchase of a unit, we'll always have 2 years worth of minutes of the meetings, of the executive committee meetings as well in the ACT. It will have things like a history of the levies. So you'll have an understanding of how the levies have gone up, what the condition of the building is, what the relationship is between parties that manage the building, what the relationship is between them and...
It's not always good.
Yeah, it's not. And between them and people who built the building or have provided services to the building. So there's some real history there. Sometimes it's a real juicy gossip sort of piece, but you need to understand, because if you think about what a body corporate is, it's kind of like a tiny council for your building. So they're a group of, for starters, volunteers, representatives of every owner. and they're charged with assisting with the oversight and the decision making for managing common property. And the common property can be, just the common areas and the walkways. In many cases, it's also the structure of the building and shared infrastructure. So they don't work for you, but they're nominated to sort of exercise some roles on your behalf, and how they interact is probably relevant. You may wish to be involved in that, or you may wish to have no involvement at all and just go with the flow. But it's really an eyes wide open thing, and it's subject to change. They turn over. They're sort of annual or sometimes 2-year appointments to those positions. So there's a lot to know and there's a lot to be wary of, but it's really have a bit of a feel around, have a look. There are people that can help with body corporate records and inspections. What you get in the contract is a prescribed pack of information. There is more information available. You're entitled to inspect the body corporate records. People will do that as a paid service. So you may use a tiered approach, and you may say, well, I've read the minutes and I've read what's in here. I think there might be more to the story, or it looks like there's some other information. And so you might retain the services of someone to do an inspection and write you a report, and they will go through in far more detail and read records that aren't included in that pack and give you some more information. So that's all really important. And I think, like you alluded to, it's not always the worst thing that there is something going on with the building. Buildings need maintenance. Your house needs maintenance, and you wear the cost of that yourself. If you buy a house and a month later a pipe blows up, that's good. It's your pipe, it's your house, you'll have to pay for it. So there's some upsides to body corporate living, being that cost is shared and defrayed between everybody that's there. There might have been and should have been some provisioning for the replacement of assets over the life cycle. So if it's 20 years old, it should have a fund and a works project that's focused around the obsolescence and replacement of shared infrastructure. So you should have a bit of a head start. It shouldn't be, oh, there's a problem here and everything's a disaster. But it's an eyes wide open, use your instincts and have a feel around and ask questions. Your lawyers will give you some guidance around what particular things mean, but there's a subjectivity to some of this history as well, which requires you to, I suppose, understand your priorities and tolerance for risk, and then maybe work it into the price, maybe make a decision to go elsewhere. It's up to you, but do it with your eyes open.
Yeah, no, that's really important. And I must admit that for a long time, I was never involved with any executive committee. And I'm not currently on any executive committee, although I have been in the past. But then suddenly issues blew up, and they blew up in a big way. And it was really fascinating to hear. And what I did notice that is when particular people's units were affected by things, they wanted strong, action by the body corporate. When it wasn't their unit, they suddenly became very involved about the cost. So as an owner and an occupier,
it's a really tricky space. I should say I've been on executive committees. I've advised executive committees in my capacity as a solicitor. I've acted against them for owners, and they can be really personality driven, which is bad because you're really exercising kind of like a director of a company or a council member. You should really be acting for the benefit of the building as a whole, not to prosecute your agenda to get, Fred's balcony retiled, for instance. So, but we are humans, and this is sort of cohabitation and co-living. So people get on there with their own agendas, and those sorts of things happen. I'd be really cautious about the types of problems that you can see with conflict at the committee level. I'd be cautious about people being in and out of the tribunals. In the ACT, it's ACAT, and in New South Wales, NCAT. Where you have disputes that are going back and forth all the time, that's a problem. And where you have contemplated litigation, it may be manageable. But again, is it something you're willing to either engage with and follow along and embrace, or totally ignore and live with the consequences? Or is it something that you would just prefer was a part of someone else's life and not yours? And that's part of the decision-making cycle for buying these properties. There's only so much advice can do about it. It's what you want and what your priorities are.
So before we move on to thinking about selling and the risks, for buying, are there any other big risks?
If you're buying property, I mean, there's no shortage of risk. If the whole thing is risk, right? It's the treatment of risk and the management of risk. So I would say treating the risk should be a priority. Using a lawyer is essential. If you don't, I almost can't put I can't put a bracket around what the risk might be. I mean, in the ACT, we've seen things like Mr. Fluffy issues arise later on. We see defects
Yep.
arising. You're trying to use professionals to limit any of that risk and mitigate it and manage it and be a bit aware of it. In other jurisdictions, in the ACT, you're a bit lucky in the sense that there will always be, if you're buying a house, there'll always be a building and pest inspection report attached with the contract. That's essential. In other jurisdictions around Australia, that is a buyer responsibility. So that is a huge area of risk. If you sort of proceed on, sign a contract and don't get this report, you really are taking a huge roll of the dice. And for some people, that's okay. For me, it wouldn't be.
That's phenomenal because you wouldn't really get one unless you're very serious. And there's those whole issues too about having access to do them because you don't have that property yet.
You will very commonly be granted access, but you'll be required to sort of pay for it yourself. So it's really common to get one. Most people, if you're doing your due diligence, will arrange one on your own expense if you're sort of serious about the purchase. But it slows the process down, and I suppose this goes back to knowing what you want from your conveyance and your conveyancer, and maybe having an understanding of the landscape, that we're not purchasing a t-shirt or a car or a holiday where you see something you want and you say, great, I see it, I like it, I'll just have this. There's a lot more that sort of goes into it and a lot more players. And if you understand that, you can anticipate it and you won't necessarily feel like every one of these things is a new obstacle or challenge to climb over. It's just part and parcel of this process of arranging the purchase or sale of a property.
Wise words. You wouldn't be a lawyer at all by any chance.
Look, I've done thousands of these for everybody, ranging from first home buyers, people sort of selling down, developers selling hundreds of units, trusts buying or selling, $50 or $80 million buildings. So there's a really diverse range, and you really learn a lot that everybody is so different in what they want and in their expectations. As the solicitor, you start with, well, this is what I do and how I do it. And if I'm not asked, I'm not going to deviate because there's no time. We're doing hundreds. But if you can have these conversations early on, it's better for us and better for you as well, because we can say, oh, no, it's a fixed fee job. We don't call you every day for an update. That's not how this is going to work. And you can say, oh, okay, that's what I expected. That's what I want. I'll go elsewhere, or how much will that cost? But there is a real benefit in having cards out on the table.
Yeah, I can imagine. So from the seller's point of view, what are the kind of risks? What are the kind of things that could happen?
Not as much can go wrong for the seller. Properly advised, they're usually sitting pretty high on the hill. If their lawyers have done their job, they don't have a great deal of risk. Not discharging their mortgage in time is a problem, but that's really after the exchange point. Not making really frank disclosures to their lawyers or their real estate agents about what is actually going on with the property is probably a risk point as well. But most people play things with a pretty straight bat. Your lawyers and your agents will be able to tell you that's like something that's really important, we've got to deal with it, or it doesn't matter and it's not our problem. And then I would say, again, expectations are just a huge part of it. And I'm not a real estate agent. I was a private practice lawyer, but we know what the market is like at the moment. In November 24, we've got properties staying on market a little bit longer than they were, well, a lot longer than they were 2 years ago. That is obvious. Well, in my view, that's driven by sellers having expectations about price above the market, right? If someone's willing to pay what you're willing to sell it for, it's not going to sit on the market. So that's okay. But if you've got priorities around, I want this sold in a month, then you might need to have a frank discussion about what that's going to take. Because if you want it sold in a month, but you want it sold for 100 grand above market value, you've got, potentially a problem. You need a pretty magical real estate agent. And so the next thing for them would be early engagement with a legal team and with a real estate agency. If you're selling, often you already have a lawyer, maybe you don't though. The agent will be a good source of information on both of those things. They have people they like to team up with, but you might need some specialist advice. And so managing what you want out of the process and making sure that the steps you take are consistent with what you want, i.e. if you want a top price and you want an immediate sale, you might need to reassess how that works. I think you're going to have a much better ride.
So have you had circumstances where a seller has had to go after the deposit because the sale hasn't gone through?
I have.
And that's interesting because these days, even though it's meant to be 10% in the ACT, a lot of people are only putting down 5%.
That's right. It's not a fun position to be in, I think, for anyone that's involved. I mean, you probably see in the movies, people are like, great, we'll take a deposit, or, they've breached the deal. I actually don't think many people enjoy that part of the process when it comes to fruition. In the ACT, even if you've paid only a 5% deposit, the contractual term is that the whole deposit is due. So you're potentially liable for the other 5% anyway, and someone can chase you for it if you default. So that's a risk to keep in mind. It doesn't always eventuate. And sometimes the seller will just keep the 5% deposit. Sometimes you can negotiate with them about what it's going to look like. But it's a really dangerous position to be in, and it's certainly not much fun. I know it's definitely no fun for the buyers and the sellers. The buyers, if they're losing their deposit, and not many of the sellers, I think, crack the champagne after having to take those steps, but it's usually an incident of they actually have suffered real loss, and they might have to, if it was an auction, they need to go back to market now. They potentially lost that pool of buyers they had all lined up, ready to buy. So they have suffered some loss as well, and it's just a really sad set of circumstances when it takes place.
Yeah, exactly. Because people notice, they're going, well, it was about to be sold. It wasn't sold. Like, what's wrong with this property? And of course, there may be absolutely nothing wrong with it at all. The problem was the finance for the buyers. But yeah, people will look at the vendors and go, yeah, like, it sort of smells of desperation then, doesn't it?
Yeah, look, there's so many reasons why something can be delayed or go wrong, or like it all sounds from the outside, and when you don't spend a lot of time in there, it sounds like it's easy. We just move this to here, but there are so many players and moving parts for different things. It can unravel for unforeseen circumstances. It doesn't happen it doesn't happen so regularly that you should panic about it. But you should be careful and be prepared. And I think, that process of managing your own expectations and intentions and being clear and choosing good advisors and then listening to them is really important. I mean, a barrister once told me, I think when we were giving him too much instruction, he said, you don't buy a dog and then bark for it. And what he meant was, leave that to me. You've paid me to do that job. So sit down and I'll do this part. There's some sense in that, not in, hands off the wheel, let everybody else drive. But you want to try and choose specialists that you trust to give you good feedback, and to be able to make decisions and to be able to discuss it with you. And if you do that, I think 90% of the way there.
Thank you. Now, I have to ask, and I know the answer to this, Ox Rooms. So what does Ox Rooms do? So why have you founded it, and what is the problem it's looking to solve?
Wow. So Ox Rooms is our platform. We founded it, well, we only kicked off a few months ago, but it's a real estate platform for agents, conveyancers, and clients to manage the front end of a real estate transaction. And so what I mean by that is it's kind of like an online deal room where the lawyers and the agents are talking to each other, and the buyers and the sellers have a degree of visibility and transparency around where these things are up to. And it's born out of the idea, obviously, historically I was managing these transactions, and they go through email, and there's a big black hole kind of for everybody with so many different people, and a real benefit to bringing it all together, having the right documents in the right place, and allowing people to check in at their convenience about where things are up to and what progress has been made. So it's like I say, it's a new platform. It's operational, has things like digital signing and all that modern stuff, and it's very secure. But the idea was to elevate the experience for everybody, really, for agents getting better visibility, for buyers and sellers having better visibility, and so lower levels of stress and concern and tension, and lower effort required to chase up. And of course, I put in a lot of efficiency for the lawyers who have to do a lot of the work of bouncing pages around and that sort of stuff, so that everybody would get a smoother, faster process.
Wow, and you kind of wonder why this wasn't done before, but it's sort of an industry that really hasn't seen a lot of innovation.
Yeah, I mean, I would be unfair. I'd probably say that a lot. I'd be unfair to everyone if I said there was no innovation, but we follow processes that are long-standing processes, and we have tools there. But I know other industries have really benefited from just adapting this sort of more collaborative work model, more project-centric work model for specific events. And I just thought there was a great case for it with the legal work. And I know with other aspects of legal work, we do things like that. But the business case wasn't always there for conveyancing, and that's because it can be really cost heavy. So we decided to build something that could deliver that functionality, deliver those benefits, but deliver it to a sector in the market that I think had been left out.
Wonderful. So I have had a bit of a look beneath the bonnet, shall we say, and it works really well. So if you're looking to buy or sell property, suggest you check out Oxrooms. So Matthew, I have one final question for you, and you know it's coming. Do you have a Frugalista tip to share?
I do have a Frugalista tip. I don't know if it's up to the same standard as some of your other guests. It's a really simple one, and it is $4 a kilo chicken drumsticks from Coles and Woolworths. I don't want to sound like Bubba Gump, but you can do anything with these things. They're cheap. They can be fried. They can go in soup. I had chicken noodle soup cooked by Emmy's mother last night, but they're great. They're cheap, so I'd say get after it.
I'm a big fan, actually, of the chicken drumsticks. They're great in a curry, actually, a lovely big, Malaysian chicken curry with some potatoes. Delicious. Yeah, baked, delicious. I've got a teen and a tween who are both quite active, and it's kind of hard to keep them full, and that really helps.
Fantastic. Well, I'm glad that met the standard.
Met the standard. Feel like I'm too scary now. Anyway, thank you so much. So now if people want to find Oxrooms, they can find you online is it Oxrooms?
Yeah, www.oxrooms.com.au, or on Instagram at ox.rooms. Also a really easy way to get to us.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for sharing.
Fabulous. Thank you so much for having me on, Serena. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.